Eleanor Hayes was sitting in her wheelchair by the window of the home she had built with her own two hands when she heard her husband's voice through the thin wall, telling his lawyer that she had become nothing more than dead weight, a burden he no longer had the patience to carry. She did not cry. She did not call out. She simply folded her hands in her lap, looked out at the garden she had planted the year they got married, and waited for him to say the rest, because some part of her already knew this moment had been coming for a very long time. What Robert Callahan did not know, as he sat in the next room signing away 22 years of marriage, was that the empire he was so desperate to protect, the one carrying his name on every building and every business card, still legally belonged to the wife he was throwing away. Robert Callahan believed he had already won before the ink was even dry. He believed that a woman confined to a wheelchair, a woman who could no longer walk the factory floor or stand beside him at shareholder meetings, had outlived her usefulness to him. He was wrong in a way that would take him nearly a year to fully understand, and by the time he understood it, it would already be too late to undo what he had set in motion. This is the story of a woman the world believed had lost everything the day an accident took the use of her legs, and the story of the husband who mistook her silence for surrender, never once suspecting that the very foundation of everything he owned still bore her name. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For 22 years, Robert Callahan told anyone who would listen that he built his company from nothing, that he clawed his way up from a small rented office with 3 employees to a manufacturing empire that stretched across 4 states. What he rarely mentioned, and what almost no one outside the family ever knew, was that the money that saved his company during its hardest year did not come from a bank loan or an investor he charmed at a dinner party. It came from Eleanor, from the inheritance her father left her, from a piece of land that had been in her family for 3 generations, and from a set of legal documents drawn up by her father's own attorney that Robert signed without reading closely, because in those early years he trusted her completely and had no reason to imagine a future in which he wouldn't. There were questions the people closest to this family were asking long before the divorce papers were ever filed, and they are questions we are going to answer over the course of this story. Why did Robert Callahan believe he could remove his wife from the company entirely without a single signature from her? What exactly did Eleanor Hayes still legally control, and why had she never once mentioned it? Not even after the accident, not even after the humiliating comments, not even after he moved his new girlfriend into an apartment 3 blocks from the home they used to share. And perhaps most importantly, what was the exact moment Robert Callahan realized the woman he had discarded held the one signature standing between him and everything he had spent his life building? Eleanor and Robert met the way so many ordinary love stories begin, at a diner outside of Columbus, Ohio, where she worked weekend shifts to help pay her way through business school, and he came in every Sunday morning pretending he was there for the coffee. She was sharp in a way that intimidated most of the men who tried to court her, the kind of sharp that came from growing up watching her father run a modest hardware supply business and learning, at the kitchen table, how contracts and margins and trust actually worked. Robert was ambitious in a way that people found either magnetic or exhausting depending on how close they stood to him, and Eleanor, for reasons she could never fully explain even to herself years later, found it magnetic. They married 2 years after that first cup of coffee, and from the very beginning, this was never a marriage where one person worked and the other simply waited at home. Eleanor was in the office before Robert most mornings. She was the one who negotiated their first major supplier contract when Robert was too nervous to make the call himself. She was the one who, when the company nearly collapsed during its 4th year, walked into her father's study and asked him for the loan that would save it, understanding fully what she was risking by tying her own family's legacy to her husband's unproven dream. Robert would later tell colleagues, in the early years, that Eleanor was the reason any of it existed at all, and for a long time, he meant it. It is important to understand who Eleanor Hayes was before the accident, before the wheelchair, before the word burden was ever spoken in that house, because the woman Robert Callahan tried to erase from his life was never the fragile, dependent figure he described to his lawyer. She was a founding partner in every sense except the one that mattered to the outside world, because in the paperwork, in the early legal filings drawn up hastily by a young attorney more concerned with speed than precision, Eleanor's name remained tied to the land and the original holding company in ways that neither of them thought much about once the business began to thrive. It was a detail buried in 20-year-old documents, the kind of detail a man in a hurry to divorce his disabled wife would never think to check. For the first 15 years of their marriage, Robert and Eleanor Callahan looked, from the outside, like a couple who had figured out something most people spend a lifetime searching for. They built a house together on the outskirts of Columbus with their own hands practically, choosing every fixture and every wall color on weekend trips to the hardware store where Eleanor still knew half the staff by name. They had 2 children, a son named Thomas and a daughter named Claire, and Eleanor made a point of being home for dinner even on the nights she had spent 12 hours at the company, because she remembered how absent her own father had been and swore she would do things differently. Robert, in those years, still called her his partner in every sense of the word, not just his wife, and he meant it every time he said it in front of employees, investors, and strangers at dinner parties who assumed the company belonged to him alone. There was a period, early in their marriage, when almost none of that success seemed guaranteed. Robert had started the company 2 years before he met Eleanor, working out of a converted garage with a single second-hand lathe and a handful of contracts he had scraped together through sheer persistence. And by the time they married, the business was still surviving month to month on the strength of Robert's willingness to underbid every competitor within driving distance. Eleanor, fresh out of business school, took one look at the company's books during their engagement and told him plainly, over dinner one night, that he was going to lose everything within 18 months if he did not change the way he was pricing his contracts. Robert, who by his own later admission nearly ended the relationship over how bluntly she said it, spent that night furious, and then spent the following week quietly implementing almost everything she had suggested. The company itself, which Robert had named Callahan Industries after his own family, manufactured industrial parts for agricultural equipment, a business that seemed unglamorous to outsiders, but that Robert and Eleanor had built into something genuinely impressive by their 15th year of marriage. What almost nobody outside the family understood was the structure underneath it all. The land the very first factory sat on had belonged to Eleanor's father, a quiet, careful man named Walter Hayes who ran a modest hardware supply business for 30 years before he passed it, and a good deal of land alongside it, into a family trust designed to protect his daughter no matter what happened in her life. When Robert needed capital to expand in the company's 4th year, it was that trust, administered by an old-fashioned attorney named Harold Grissom who had known Eleanor since she was a child, that quietly became the collateral behind the loan that saved everything Robert had built. At the time, Robert signed the paperwork Grissom drew up almost without reading it, distracted, eager to get back to the factory floor, trusting that whatever protected Eleanor's interests could not possibly threaten his own, since in his mind their interests were the same thing. The documents created a holding structure, Hayes Land Holdings, that retained an ownership stake in the underlying property, and, through a clause neither of them thought much about for the next 15 years, a voting interest in any sale, merger, or major restructuring of Callahan Industries itself. It was the kind of protective language careful attorneys build into deals precisely because they expect people to forget it exists, and for a long time, everyone involved did exactly that, filing it away as an old formality from the company's leaner days. Life, for a while, moved forward the way it does for most families, in a blur of school recitals, company milestones, and the slow accumulation of comfort that success brings. Thomas went off to study engineering in Michigan, following in a version of his mother's footsteps more than his father ever noticed. Claire stayed closer to home, working part-time at the company during summers, absorbing the same instincts for the business that her mother had passed down without ever formally teaching her. Robert, meanwhile, began appearing more often in local business journals, photographed in front of the company's newest facility, credited as the visionary who had transformed a small parts supplier into a regional manufacturing name. Eleanor rarely appeared in those photographs, and for years, she told herself that was simply how things worked, that some people were built for the spotlight, and others were built for the work behind it. Inside the company, however, almost everyone who had been there longer than 5 years understood the truth of how things actually functioned. Eleanor was the one who sat with new hires during their first week and explained, in plain language, exactly what the company expected of them, and exactly what they could expect in return, a habit she had inherited from watching her own father do the same thing at his hardware supply counter decades earlier. She was the one who caught a costly error in a supplier contract during the company's ninth year, a mistake that would have cost Callahan Industries nearly $400,000 had it gone unnoticed, and she was the one who personally rewrote the terms before Robert had even finished reading the first page. Longtime employees, particularly the women who worked in the office alongside her, would later describe Eleanor as the person who actually ran the place, regardless of whose name appeared on the letterhead and the building signage out front. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening in late October. On the Tulane Highway, Eleanor drove every week to visit her aging mother 2 counties over. A delivery truck ran a stop sign at an intersection she had crossed hundreds of times before, and the impact sent her car into a guardrail hard enough to crush the driver's side and leave her unconscious for 11 minutes before paramedics arrived. She survived, which the doctors at the trauma center called, more than once, a genuine miracle given the severity of the collision, but the damage to her spine was significant enough that within a week, the surgeons were using words like permanent and adjustment rather than words like recovery and return. Eleanor Callahan, who had spent her entire adult life on her feet, in factories, in boardrooms, chasing after 2 children through their backyard, would not walk again without assistance, and eventually would not walk at all. Thomas flew home from Michigan the moment Claire called him, arriving at the hospital just past 2 in the morning, still wearing the clothes he had been sitting in during his evening lab session when the phone rang. He would later describe the following weeks as the strangest and most disorienting of his life, watching his mother, a woman he had never once seen express real fear in front of him, work silently through waves of pain and uncertainty with the same steady composure she had brought to every difficult contract negotiation he had watched her handle as a child. The surgeons were careful in how they delivered the long-term prognosis, using words like adjustment and rehabilitation rather than anything more final. But Eleanor, who had spent her career reading the fine print other people glossed over, understood almost immediately what they were actually telling her. And she asked her first question about wheelchair accessibility before either of her children had fully processed what had happened. Robert was, by every account from those first weeks, genuinely devastated. He slept in a chair beside her hospital bed for the first 4 nights, called specialists across 3 states, and told anyone who asked that he would do whatever it took to get his wife the best care available anywhere in the country. Friends and family who watched him during that period remember a man who seemed shattered, who canceled meetings and let his assistant handle the company for the first time in years so that he could be present for Eleanor's early rounds of physical therapy. He learned, during those first weeks, how to help her transfer from her hospital bed to a wheelchair without hurting either of them, a task the nursing staff usually reserved for trained aides, and he insisted on doing it himself every morning, telling a nurse at one point that it was the least he could do after everything Eleanor had done for him over the years. Claire, watching her father during those early days, later admitted she had allowed herself to believe, for a brief and painful stretch of time, that the accident might end up bringing her parents closer together rather than driving them apart, a belief she would look back on with a complicated mixture of tenderness and regret once she understood how completely it would eventually be disproven. For a brief window, it looked as though the accident, as terrible as it was, might have reminded Robert of something he had quietly stopped noticing over the years, which was exactly how much of what he had built rested on the woman now relearning how to move her own body. That window did not stay open long. By the 3rd month, Robert's visits to the rehabilitation center grew shorter, then less frequent, always accompanied by an explanation involving a client, a deadline, a fire that only he could put out at the company. Eleanor, still adjusting to a wheelchair and a body that no longer obeyed her the way it once had, told herself the same story so many people tell themselves in that position, that he was overwhelmed, that men process pain differently, that he would come back to himself once the initial shock wore off. Claire, who drove her mother to appointments more often than her father did that winter, was the first person in the family to say out loud what everyone else was quietly starting to feel, which was that her father seemed less like a man in crisis and more like a man making a decision. Their 20th wedding anniversary fell that same winter, only 4 months after the accident, and it passed without acknowledgement from Robert until nearly 10 in the evening, when he came home from what he described as a late dinner with investors and seemed genuinely surprised, and then visibly uncomfortable when Claire mentioned the date at the kitchen table. Eleanor had not expected much, having spent the day in physical therapy working on tasks as small as gripping a fork with her right hand, but the silence still landed with a weight she found difficult to describe to anyone, even Claire, in the days that followed. A month later, Eleanor's rehabilitation team recommended a specialized clinic nearly 90 minutes away for a treatment they believed could meaningfully improve her mobility, and when she asked Robert if he could rearrange his schedule to drive her on the days Claire had class, he told her, not unkindly, but not warmly either, that he would try to make it work. A promise he kept exactly twice out of the 11 sessions that followed. The decision, as it turned out, had a name, and her name was Christine Pratt, a marketing director Robert had hired 18 months before the accident to modernize the company's brand. Christine was 34, sharp, ambitious in a way that reminded several longtime employees uncomfortably of a younger Eleanor, and increasingly present in Robert's calendar in ways that had nothing to do with marketing campaigns. Nobody in the family had proof of anything in those early months, only a growing collection of small, quiet observations, the kind that accumulate slowly until one day they can no longer be explained away. Robert working later. Robert traveling for meetings that used to be handled over the phone. Robert, once so meticulous about calling Eleanor every evening from the road, letting entire nights pass without a single word. One employee, a longtime production manager named Walter Nguyen who had worked under both Robert and Eleanor for nearly 15 years, later recalled a company retreat that spring where Robert introduced Christine to a group of visiting suppliers as the future of the company's public image, language he had never once used to describe anyone else on staff, including his own wife during her 2 decades of actual involvement in shaping that same public image. Nguyen said nothing at the time, assuming it was simply corporate enthusiasm getting the better of a stressed executive, but he mentioned the comment to his wife that night, and the two of them agreed privately that something about the dynamic between Robert and his new marketing director felt different from the ordinary closeness of coworkers. It was a small moment, one of dozens that individually meant very little, but that would later be remembered, collectively, as the earliest visible signs of where Robert's attention and loyalty had already begun to drift. By the following spring, roughly a year after the accident, Eleanor had regained enough strength and independence to manage most of her days without constant assistance, though the wheelchair remained a permanent part of her life. She had, by then, also begun to notice something in Robert that felt less like grief and more like distance deliberately maintained, a coldness in the way he spoke to her, a new habit of addressing her the way a person addresses an obligation rather than a partner. He stopped asking her opinion on decisions at the company, decisions she had helped shape for over 2 decades. He stopped mentioning her when he spoke to reporters, referring instead to his vision, his growth strategy, his company, in a way he had never done in the 15 years before the accident changed the shape of her body but, apparently, also changed the shape of how he saw her value. The words that broke whatever illusion remained came on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, nearly 18 months after the crash that changed everything. Eleanor had come home early from an appointment and was in the study adjoining Robert's home office when she heard his voice through the door, sharper and more clipped than she had heard it in years, speaking to someone on the phone about, as he put it, positioning himself for what was coming. She heard him say that he needed to think seriously about his future, that he could not keep building a company around a wife who could no longer keep up with the pace of the business, around dead weight that had become, in his words, more of a liability than a partner. She sat perfectly still in her wheelchair on the other side of that door for what felt like a very long time, listening to the man she had built an empire beside describe her as something to be managed rather
She's
than
become
someone
nothing
to be loved.
more than dead weight.
What struck Eleanor most
I am ready to
in the
sign
days
the
that
papers.
followed was not the cruelty of the words themselves, though they were cruel, but the calm, businesslike tone in which Robert had spoken them, as though he were discussing an underperforming supplier contract rather than the woman who had spent 22 years beside him. She replayed the conversation in her mind for weeks afterward, noticing details she had missed in the shock of the first hearing, the way he had used the word positioning as though preparing for a negotiation rather than a divorce, the way he had not once, in the portion of the call she overheard, mention their children or the life they had built together, only the practical matter of what came next for him. It was in those quiet weeks of replaying his words that Eleanor first began to understand she was no longer simply grieving a marriage that was ending, but preparing, whether she consciously admitted it to herself yet or not, for a fight she had not chosen but fully intended to win. She did not confront him that day. She did not cry in front of him, did not demand an explanation, did not give him the satisfaction of watching her fall apart the way he perhaps expected a woman in her position to fall apart. Instead, Eleanor did something that would matter far more in the months ahead than any argument could have, which was quietly call the one person outside the family who had known her longest and understood the family's finances better than anyone alive. The attorney Harold Grissom, who had drawn up her father's trust documents over 2 decades earlier and had watched, from a professional distance, as Robert built an empire on top of a foundation he had apparently forgotten still legally belonged, in part, to the woman he was preparing to discard. Grissom met with Eleanor twice that spring, going through the original Hayes land holdings documents line by line, explaining in plain terms what her father had quietly built into the structure decades earlier without ever making a show of it. The land beneath 2 of Callahan Industries' 3 facilities remained legally held by the trust, not by the company outright, a detail so old and so buried in early paperwork that Robert's own corporate attorneys, hired years later, had apparently never traced it back far enough to notice. More significantly, the original financing agreement from the company's 4th year, the one that had saved Robert's business when it was on the verge of collapse, included a voting provision requiring the holding trust's approval for any sale, merger, or major transfer of ownership involving the underlying property or a controlling interest in the company itself. In plain terms, Eleanor did not simply have a claim to alimony or a portion of shared assets in a divorce. She held a legal veto over the very deal Robert was quietly preparing to make. Grissom, then in his early 70s and long past the point where he needed to take on new clients, told Eleanor during their second meeting that her father had specifically requested the voting provision be included after watching a close friend's daughter lose everything in a bitter divorce decades earlier. A friend whose son-in-law had structured their family business in a way that left her with almost nothing despite years of unpaid labor and quiet contribution. Walter Hayes, according to Grissom, had never expected the provision to actually be used, viewing it more as an insurance policy he hoped his daughter would never need, and had specifically instructed Grissom not to mention its existence to Robert unless circumstances made it absolutely necessary. Hearing this, Eleanor sat quietly for a long moment in Grissom's office, understanding for the first time the full weight of what her father had quietly done for her decades before either of them could have imagined the exact shape the danger would eventually take. Robert filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning in early June, sending papers to the house through a courier rather than delivering the news himself, a choice Eleanor understood immediately as both cowardice and confirmation of everything she had suspected. The filing was aggressive from the start, drafted by a divorce attorney named Preston Michaels who specialized in representing high-earning spouses looking to minimize what they owed, and it framed Eleanor's role at the company in strikingly diminished terms, describing her contributions as largely domestic and supportive rather than foundational. Michaels had built a career on exactly this kind of case, advising clients in his initial consultations that the way a marriage's history gets described on paper often matters just as much as the underlying facts, and he had walked Robert through a strategy designed to minimize Eleanor's perceived role well before any formal documents were drafted. He advised Robert, according to notes later reviewed by Eleanor's own legal team during discovery, to avoid any written communication that referenced Eleanor's historical involvement in major business decisions, guidance that explained, in part, why Robert's public statements about the company had grown so noticeably narrower in the months leading up to the filing. Friends who read the filing later, people who had watched Eleanor negotiate contracts and manage the company's books for over 2 decades, found the language almost insulting in how thoroughly it erased her, as though the paperwork itself had been written to match the story Robert had been quietly telling himself for the past year and a half. Eleanor herself read the filing only once, sitting alone in the study late on the evening it arrived, and later told Grissom that the hardest part was not any single sentence, but the cumulative effect of reading 22 years of her own life reduced to a handful of paragraphs describing her as supportive rather than essential. She noted, with a kind of detached precision that surprised even her attorneys, 3 separate factual inaccuracies buried in the filing regarding dates and figures from the company's early years, errors that suggested whoever had drafted the document on Robert's behalf had relied entirely on his account of events rather than any actual review of the company's historical records. It was a small thing, noticing those errors, but it gave Eleanor an early and useful reminder that the version of their history Robert was now presenting to the world was not simply unflattering to her. It was, in places, simply untrue. Word moved quickly through the small circle of people who had known the Callahans for years, and reactions split in ways that revealed a great deal about who had actually been paying attention. Several longtime employees at Callahan Industries, particularly those who had worked closely with Eleanor during the company's early years, were quietly outraged, though most kept their opinions to themselves out of fear for their jobs under Robert's increasingly unpredictable leadership. A handful of Robert's newer business associates, people who had only known the company after its expansion and had never met Eleanor in her prime, accepted his version of events without much question, assuming that a woman in a wheelchair simply could not have been as central to the business as her husband implied she once was. It was, in its own quiet way, a second injury layered on top of the first, watching 2 decades of work get rewritten in real time by people who had never bothered to learn the actual history. Walter Nguyen, the production manager who had noticed Robert's shifting attention the previous spring, found himself in an especially uncomfortable position that summer, caught between loyalty to the man who technically signed his paychecks and a growing sense that the company he had helped build for 15 years was being quietly dismantled from the inside by decisions Eleanor had never been consulted on. He was not alone. A small group of senior staff, most of whom had joined the company during its earliest and most fragile years, began meeting informally after work, at first simply to voice frustration, and eventually to discuss, carefully and quietly, what they might do if Robert's plans for the company continued moving in a direction none of them recognized or trusted. None of them yet knew about the Hayes Land Holdings Trust, but several of them, without ever comparing notes directly, had begun independently gathering old records and contracts, sensing, correctly, that the true history of the company's ownership was more complicated than Robert's public account suggested. One member of that informal group, a longtime bookkeeper named Diane Foss, who had personally processed the company's payroll and vendor payments for nearly 18 years, quietly mentioned to Claire over coffee one afternoon that she had noticed something unusual years earlier while filing old tax documents, a reference to a holding entity she had never been able to fully place within the company's official structure. At the time, Diane had simply assumed it was an outdated administrative artifact and moved on. But she found herself thinking about it again as rumors of Robert's plans to sell the company began circulating that summer, and she mentioned the detail to Claire mostly out of a nagging sense that it might matter more than she had originally assumed. Claire, in turn, brought the observation to her mother almost as an afterthought during one of their regular weekend visits, unaware at the time that she was handing Eleanor a thread that, combined with what Grissom already knew, would soon become central to everything that followed. Claire, now working full-time at the company and increasingly uncomfortable with her father's behavior, found herself in the difficult position of watching Robert make decisions that seemed designed to move quickly, before anyone could slow him down. Within weeks of filing for divorce, he began quiet conversations with a private equity firm about a potential sale of Callahan Industries, a move that would have allowed him to walk away with a substantial payout while sidelining Eleanor entirely from any future stake in the business. He told colleagues he wanted to simplify his life, to free himself from complications, language that Claire, listening from the next room during one particularly tense phone call, recognized as the same language he had once used to describe her mother on that Thursday afternoon in the study. Eleanor, throughout this period, remained remarkably composed in a way that unsettled Robert more than any outburst could have. She did not contest the divorce filing publicly, did not speak to reporters when a local business journal ran a brief, sympathetic piece about the end of the Callahan marriage, and did not confront Robert directly about Christine Pratt, whose relationship with him had become an open secret by that summer. Instead, Working quietly with Grissom and a second attorney experienced in complex business litigation, she began assembling the full picture of exactly what the old trust documents entitled her to, and exactly what would happen the moment Robert attempted to move forward with any sale or restructuring of the company without her consent. The private equity deal Robert had been pursuing reached its final stage in late August, roughly 3 months after the divorce filing, with a purchase price that would have made him a wealthy man several times over even after splitting assets with Eleanor under a standard divorce settlement. He had structured the deal, with Preston Michaels' help, to close before the divorce was finalized, believing that speed would allow him to present Eleanor with a settlement based on a smaller, already diminished version of the company rather than the fully realized sale price the private equity firm was prepared to pay. It was, in Robert's mind, a clean solution, one that would let him walk away with the bulk of the company's value while Eleanor received what he considered a generous but limited share, calculated on his terms and on his timeline. The private equity firm pursuing the deal, a mid-sized regional group called Ashford Capital, had been eyeing Callahan Industries for nearly 2 years before Robert finally agreed to serious talks, drawn by the company's steady growth and its reputation for reliability among agricultural equipment manufacturers across the Midwest. Their lead negotiator, a methodical woman named Patricia Suarez, had insisted from the earliest conversations on a full and independent review of the company's ownership structure before any final numbers were agreed upon, a standard practice she followed on every acquisition regardless of how straightforward a seller made things appear. Robert, eager to close quickly and confident that his own attorneys had already reviewed everything relevant, found her insistence mildly irritating but did not think to question it, assuming, as he had assumed for nearly 2 decades, that there was nothing left in the company's paperwork that could possibly surprise him at this stage. Suarez had, in fact, delayed the deal twice already over smaller administrative issues before the ownership complications surfaced, a pattern of caution that several of Robert's own advisors privately found excessive, though none of them raised strong objections given how much value Ashford Capital was prepared to pay for the acquisition. Robert had told Christine, during one of their increasingly frequent dinners that summer, that the deal would likely close by early autumn, a timeline he repeated with enough confidence that she had already begun quietly looking at properties in a wealthier suburb, an ambition that would end up costing her considerably more disappointment than either of them anticipated at the time. The private equity firm's legal team, as a standard practice in any acquisition of this size, ran a thorough title and ownership search on every piece of property and every equity structure tied to Callahan Industries before finalizing the purchase agreement. It was during that routine search, conducted by a junior associate methodically working through decades of old filings, that the Hayes Land Holdings Trust surfaced, along with the original financing agreement from the company's 4th year and its voting provision requiring the trust sign-off on exactly the kind of transaction Robert was now trying to finalize. The associate flagged it immediately as a critical issue, and within 48 hours, the entire deal Robert had spent months quietly assembling came to a complete stop, pending resolution of what the firm's attorneys called, in careful legal language, an unresolved ownership complication. The young associate who found the filing, a recent law school graduate named Marcus Bell working his first major acquisition, later described the moment almost anticlimactically, saying he had simply been cross-referencing county property records against the company's disclosed assets when a name appeared that did not match anything in Robert's official ownership documentation. He flagged the discrepancy to Patricia Suarez in a routine memo, expecting it might be nothing more than an outdated filing that needed to be cleared administratively, and it was only after Suarez herself dug into the original 1998 financing agreement referenced in the trust documents that the true scope of the complication became clear. Suarez, who had built her career on exactly this kind of careful, unglamorous diligence work, called it, in a conversation with a colleague afterward, the most consequential thing a first-year associate had ever handed her, and she made the decision within the hour to pause the entire transaction rather than risk closing a deal with a legal defect that could unravel years later. Robert learned about the discovery not from his own attorneys, who were scrambling to understand a document their firm had apparently never traced back far enough to notice, but from a terse phone call from the private equity firm's lead partner informing him that the deal could not proceed until the trust holding a stake in his company's underlying assets provided formal written consent. For the first time in 18 months, Robert Callahan felt something closer to fear than frustration, a dawning recognition that the wife he had spent a year and a half describing as dead weight, as a liability, as someone whose usefulness had expired the moment her legs stopped working, still held, quietly and legally, the one signature standing between him and the sale of everything he had built his new life around. His own longtime corporate attorney, a man named Gerald Finch who had handled routine legal matters for Callahan Industries for nearly 12 years, spent an entire weekend combing through old file cabinets in his office, visibly shaken by the discovery that a provision this significant had apparently gone unnoticed under his watch for over a decade. Finch's explanation, delivered to Robert in an uncomfortable meeting the following Monday, was that the original financing agreement had been handled by a different, smaller firm during the company's early and cash-strapped years, and that when Finch's office took over the company's legal work years later, the older documents had simply been archived rather than fully re-examined, a common enough oversight that nonetheless offered Robert little comfort given the stakes now involved. Robert, according to two people present for parts of that meeting, spent much of it in stunned silence, occasionally repeating the question of how something like this could have existed for over 20 years without anyone, including himself, ever fully understanding what he had actually signed. He called Eleanor directly for the first time since the divorce filing, his voice carrying a tone she had not heard from him since the earliest, most desperate days after her accident, though this time the desperation was entirely his own. He asked, without much preamble, whether she was aware of some complication with the company's land, whether there was something she needed to sign so the sale could move forward, framing it as a minor formality rather than what both of them now understood it actually was. Eleanor, sitting in the same study where she had once overheard him describe her as dead weight through a closed door, told him calmly that she was very well aware of the trust, that she had been aware of it for months, and that she would be happy to discuss it, but only through her attorney, and only as part of a conversation about the divorce settlement as a whole rather than as a favor to speed along his private equity deal. What followed over the next several weeks was less a negotiation than a slow, methodical reckoning, conducted almost entirely through attorneys, in which Robert was forced to confront exactly how much of Callahan Industries had never fully belonged to him in the way he had spent 2 decades assuming it did. Grissom and Eleanor's litigation attorney made clear, in a series of increasingly detailed letters to Preston Michaels, that Eleanor was prepared to withhold the trust's consent indefinitely if necessary, effectively freezing any sale or major restructuring of the company for as long as the divorce proceedings dragged on. This was not, Eleanor made clear through her attorneys, an act of spite or an attempt to punish Robert for the affair or the humiliating language in his divorce filing. It was, instead, a simple insistence that any resolution reflect the truth of what she had actually built alongside him, rather than the diminished, domestic version of her contribution that Robert's filing had described. A tense board meeting that September brought the standoff into full view of the company's senior leadership for the first time, when Robert attempted to explain the delay in the Ashford Capital deal without directly acknowledging the trust complication at its center. Walter Nguyen, who had been quietly gathering his own understanding of the company's ownership history alongside several colleagues, asked a pointed question about whether the delay involved any claim tied to the original Hayes family financing, a question that visibly caught Robert off guard, and that he answered evasively enough that several board members exchanged uneasy glances across the table. It was the first moment several senior employees realized that the rumors circulating quietly through the company for weeks about some kind of legal complication tied to Eleanor were not simply gossip, but something Robert himself was actively trying to manage and contain. Robert, cornered in a way he had never anticipated, spent much of that autumn oscillating between anger and something closer to desperation, according to people close to the negotiations. He fired Preston Michaels at one point, convinced a more aggressive attorney might find a way around the trust provisions, only to receive the same answer from a second and then a third firm, each concluding that the original documents Walter Hayes had insisted upon decades earlier were airtight, drafted precisely to prevent exactly this kind of maneuver. Christine Pratt, according to two former employees who spoke about the period afterward, grew increasingly frustrated as the private equity deal stalled indefinitely, eventually distancing herself from Robert as it became clear that the wealthy, unencumbered future he had promised her was not going to materialize on the timeline either of them had expected. The second attorney Robert hired that autumn, a litigator from Cleveland with a reputation for aggressive tactics, spent nearly 3 weeks searching for any conceivable argument that the trust provision was outdated, unenforceable, or improperly executed, eventually concluding, in a blunt memo Robert reportedly read twice before setting it down without a word, that Walter Hayes' original attorney had drafted the documents with unusual precision specifically to withstand exactly this kind of challenge decades later. A third firm, brought in briefly in September, suggested the only realistic path forward was a negotiated settlement rather than continued legal resistance, advice that Robert initially rejected outright before eventually, weeks later, coming to the same conclusion himself. Each failed attempt to find a way around Eleanor's position cost Robert both money and time, and more quietly, began to erode the confident, untouchable image he had spent 2 decades cultivating among colleagues who were now watching, with growing curiosity, exactly how this standoff between him and his disabled wife was going to end. By late October, almost exactly 2 years after the accident that had first put Eleanor in a wheelchair, Robert requested a formal meeting, not through his attorneys this time, but directly, asking Eleanor if they could speak in person at the same house they had built together at the very beginning of their marriage. Claire, who had grown increasingly protective of her mother throughout the ordeal, offered to be present, but Eleanor declined, telling her daughter she needed to hear whatever Robert had to say on her own terms. In the home, she had no intention of giving up regardless of how the settlement concluded. When Robert arrived that afternoon, Eleanor met him in the same study where he had once described her, through a closed door, as dead weight. Only this time, she was the one who remained composed while he struggled to find the words for what he had come to say. Robert arrived nearly 15 minutes early, a detail Eleanor noted with quiet interest, given how consistently late he had been to nearly every appointment involving her over the previous 2 years, and he spent much of that waiting time standing awkwardly in the garden they had planted together decades earlier rather than sitting in the car. The final settlement, reached in December after months of negotiation, gave Eleanor majority ownership of Callahan Industries, an outcome that would have seemed almost unthinkable to anyone reading Robert's original divorce filing 18 months earlier. The agreement was signed in Grissom's office rather than in any courtroom, a detail Eleanor specifically requested, telling her attorneys she wanted the final resolution to take place in the same quiet, unglamorous setting where her father had first protected her decades before anyone else in the family understood why it mattered. Robert signed the documents with noticeably less composure than he had once brought to every negotiation of his career, and according to Grissom, who had by then known both members of the Callahan family for nearly 30 years, it was the first time he had ever seen Robert's hands visibly unsteady while holding a pen. Robert retained a minority stake and stepped back from day-to-day leadership of the company, a role that passed, in a development few people outside the family had predicted, to Claire, who had spent the past 2 years watching both of her parents navigate the worst version of themselves and had quietly resolved to run the business differently than either of them had. Eleanor, rather than selling her controlling stake to the private equity firm that had originally uncovered the trust complication, chose instead to keep Callahan Industries independent, renaming it Hayes Manufacturing within the year in a decision that finally, publicly, restored her name to the foundation her father had protected decades earlier. Claire's transition into leadership was gradual rather than immediate, beginning with an expanded operations role that fall and growing, over the following 18 months, into full responsibility for the company's daily direction, a progression Eleanor guided closely from her position as chairwoman while deliberately avoiding the kind of singular, name-on-the-building dominance that had defined Robert's tenure. Walter Nguyen, the production manager who had watched Robert's attention drift years earlier, was among the first senior staff Claire promoted into a more central leadership role, a decision employees throughout the company understood as a clear signal of the values the new leadership intended to prioritize going forward. Within 2 years of the settlement, Hayes Manufacturing had not only recovered fully from the uncertainty of the divorce period, but had expanded into 2 new facilities. A growth trajectory that several longtime observers of the regional manufacturing industry attributed directly to the stability and institutional knowledge Eleanor brought back to the company after years of being quietly sidelined from its public narrative. In the months that followed the settlement, Eleanor used a portion of the proceeds and her renewed position at the company to fund a rehabilitation and mobility center in the same town where her own accident had happened, a facility designed to give other families access to the kind of specialized care that had been difficult and expensive to find during her own recovery. The center, which she named simply the Hayes Family Mobility Center after her father rather than after herself, opened its doors 2 years after the settlement with a staff that included several of the same physical therapists who had worked with Eleanor during her own recovery. Therapists she had specifically sought out and asked to help design a program that addressed not just physical rehabilitation, but the practical, financial, and emotional barriers families often face after a life-altering injury. Thomas, who had gone on to finish his engineering degree in Michigan, contributed to the design of several pieces of adaptive equipment used at the facility, a project he later described as the most meaningful work he had done since graduating, born directly out of watching his mother navigate a system that had not been built with people like her in mind. Claire, meanwhile, established a small scholarship fund through the company for children of employees who acquired disabilities, ensuring that the lesson their family had learned so painfully would translate into something lasting for people well outside their own immediate circle. Diane Foss, the longtime bookkeeper whose small observation had helped set everything in motion, was among the first people Eleanor personally thanked once the settlement was finalized, and Eleanor made a point afterward of ensuring Diane was included in nearly every major planning meeting for the Mobility Center, a gesture Diane later said meant more to her than any bonus or formal recognition the company could have offered. She spoke publicly about the experience only once, in a short interview with the same local business journal that had once run a sympathetic piece about the end of her marriage, where she described the years following her accident not as the moment she lost her value, but as the moment she finally understood exactly how much of it had never depended on her ability to walk into a room unassisted in the first place. Robert, for his part, remained largely out of public view in the years that followed, his minority stake in the company he once ran quietly diminishing in influence as Claire, and eventually Eleanor's returning involvement in strategic decisions, reshaped Hayes Manufacturing into something closer to what it had always quietly been underneath his name on the building. Those who knew him during that period describe a man who seemed genuinely changed by the experience, though whether that change reflected real growth or simply the consequences of losing everything he had tried to take remains, in the words of one former colleague, a question only Robert himself could answer honestly. What is certain is that the empire he once tried to build without the woman he called dead weight never fully belonged to him in the first place, and the year he spent trying to prove otherwise cost him far more than the company he was so afraid of losing. Robert eventually sold most of his remaining minority stake in the company roughly 4 years after the settlement, using the proceeds to start a much smaller consulting venture that, according to 2 former colleagues who stayed in occasional contact with him, never came close to replicating the scale or success of the business he had once run. He remained in touch with Thomas over the years, their relationship gradually, cautiously rebuilding itself in a way that neither man discussed publicly, though Claire's relationship with her father remained noticeably more distant, shaped permanently by what she had witnessed her mother endure during those 2 difficult years. Christine Pratt left Callahan Industries entirely within months of the private equity deal collapsing, taking a marketing position at a competing firm 2 states away, and by most accounts, she and Robert did not remain in contact once the practical usefulness each had represented to the other quietly dissolved alongside the deal that never closed. Eleanor Hayes, now in her early 60s, still works several days a week from an office at the company that once again carries her family's name, arriving each morning in the same wheelchair that Robert once believed had made her worthless, in a building that stands, quite literally, on land her father protected specifically because he understood, long before anyone else in this story did, exactly what his daughter was capable of building and exactly how much some people are willing to underestimate a woman simply because her body no longer moves the way it once did. Her story, For the people who worked alongside her through those 2 difficult years, stands as a reminder that the things we build with patience, care, and quiet foresight often outlast the people who try to claim them for themselves. Visitors to Hayes Manufacturing today are often struck by a small, unassuming plaque near the entrance of the original factory building, one that Eleanor insisted on installing herself rather than leaving to a marketing team, bearing her father's name and a single line from the original 1998 financing agreement that once quietly protected everything she would later have to fight to reclaim. Walter and Gwen, still with the company after more than 2 decades, tells new hires during their first week much the same thing Eleanor once told him, that the people who actually build a company are rarely the ones whose names end up on the building, and that the wisest leaders are the ones who remember that difference long before circumstances force them to. Eleanor herself, when asked by a young employee several years after the settlement whether she ever regretted the quiet years she spent working without recognition before the divorce, reportedly answered only that regret was a luxury she had never had time for, and that she had always known, long before anyone else needed to, exactly what she had built and exactly what it was worth. What would you have done in Eleanor's position, and did you see the twist coming before Robert did? Let us know in the comments below. We would genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this one. And if this story moved you, wait until you hear about the husband who spent 12 years building a second family in secret, only to have his double life unravel because of a single voicemail his wife was never supposed to hear. Subscribe now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories.